We are now looking at a um, presentation that deals with the theological arrangement methodologies. It's kind of a review, if you will, of John Selhammer. We're looking at diachronic versus synchronic arrangements. Selhammer asked the question about which is the best way to arrange the theological concepts of the Old Testament. Do we develop a theology that attempts to understand and explain the Old Testament as a whole? Or should our aim be an understanding only of its parts sequentially arranged throughout the Old Testament itself? Now, I'm working from a Kindle edition, and therefore there are Kindle locations when I give these quotations, the larger quotations. If the theologian focuses on the diverse particularities of themes and ideas as they sequentially present themselves in the Hebrew Scriptures, then the arrangement is called diachronic, or through time. If, on the other hand, the theologian organizes the particular theological themes, say perhaps around one or two central ideas, then the arrangement is called synchronic. Now, going back to his earlier discussion in the earlier portions of his book, he discusses a difference between looking at the Bible and interpreting by text or event. And going back to those earlier discussions, Selhammer points out that it's possible to present the text or the event either diachronically or synchronically. The theology that unfolds in each case will naturally be of a like kind, with the theologian's view of the choice between event or text as the basis of the teaching which he draws from each. In his perspective of the diachronic approach, Selhammer states the term diachronic is taken to represent any view that includes the notion that an Old Testament theology should present itself as an unfolding of the central theological message of the Old Testament. The key here is the term unfolding. Selhammer then addresses four types of diachronic arrangement. He speaks of temporal, then logical, thematic, and then accumulative. Let's look for a moment at the diachronic approach, looking at the diachronic temporal. In this approach, the attempt is made to demonstrate the earliest stage of theology in the Old Testament, and then starting from there to follow its development and progression down to its latest stages. Now, he draws some examples from the theological arrangements of Voss, Holscher, von Rad, and Eichrodt. Voss saw various theologies that were given across time. He saw a pre-redemptive theology, and he would say this is the theology that one finds in the narrative of Genesis in the time of Adam before the fall. Now, this is followed sequentially then by the first redemptive special revelation. Here he refers to Genesis 3:15, when after the fall God speaks of the punishments that he sets upon man, and then a promise, if you will, that there would be a seed to come, a descendant of the woman to come, who would crush the head of the serpent. So this is the theology that after the fall, God promises this seed to come from Eve for the redemption of man following the fall. So you see a sequence. You've got pre-redemptive theology, then moving into first redemptive special revelation from God. The sequential revelation that follows that, or there is a sequential revelation. The next one that follows in line is the revelation to Noah. The theology in this revelation includes the development of man up to and including the flood. Following this, Voss posits the next theological revelation as being the patriarchal period. The theological elements of the times of Abraham through Joseph. So he takes that as another special revelatory section, and he sees in it a development beyond what were in the previous revelations. And these are presented from Genesis chapter 12 through chapter 50. The next sequence study for theological consideration is called the Mosaic revelation. Now this would include the theological elements in the Mosaic law, as well as the accompanying narrative history of that time period. And this would go on to the next sequence, if you will, the next revelatory sequence, which would be prophetic revelation. Following the Mosaic period, Voss then searches the prophetic writings for some additional theological developments. And then, of course, he concludes with a New Testament theology. So you can see the sequence that is given here throughout. Now, while Selhammer notes the specific sequential eras in his search for Old Testament theology, he's really fairly sparse, if you will, in showing specific advancements in each of those areas. Now, I realize it's not Selhammer's purpose to replicate in totality the theological treatment of each one of these eras, each one of these revelations. That would require, of course, a full book on each. But a chosen element might be used or seen in its development across this sequential spectrum. And that would have been very, very helpful. If you just choose one element and say, well, here's how it advances through the sequence. The sequential arrangement by Voss would certainly be seen as beneficial in noting redemptive theology, especially between the time when no sin had been committed, the pre-fall Adamic era, and then the subsequent theology post-fall. Now, the differences in man would be a little marked well. I'm going to be dealing with this at the end of our discussion and just actually looking at man and some of the differences you see afterwards. But there would be, I guess you could say, in one sense, marked, but we'll look at that later. Then we turn to diachronic temporal, and he uses Holscher. Turning to the critical historical Wellhausen era, Selhammer noted that Holscher presented a theology beginning with a pre-Israelite, with the pre-Israelite religions of Canaan. Now, that would say then that he's moving outside the text of the Bible, so this becomes more event oriented. In other words, not limiting yourself just to the biblical text. He continued by dividing his theology into 5 more periods. The period of the early Israelite, the Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman periods. And much of this would seem to continue to require an event-oriented approach, especially for the Hellenistic period between Malachi and Matthew. So it is diachronic, it is temporal, but it's not strictly text-oriented. It would also be event-oriented because he's looking outside the text at the events behind the happenings in some areas. Von Rad used the concept of the name of God to determine the theology of Israel. The placement of Yahweh in the text was used to determine the progression of Israelite theology. The places where Yahweh is used in several sequences of revelatory acts with variant content settings, that was Von Rad's methodology for ascertaining changing Israelite theology. And of course, the documenting hypothesis is to a great degree based upon this change of names with regard to God, whether we call him Elohim, whether we call him Yahweh. So they would look through that and try to posit, if you will, or produce when the theologies began, and they would then, based on that, say that this theology, this particular concept of God, predated the other concept of God. Eichrot blended both synchronic and diachronic approaches in his theological proposals. While looking at the overall teaching about God, Selhammer states about Eichrot's work, beginning with the Mosaic period, Eichrot samples the nature of Israel's religion by viewing cross-sectional cuts into it at various temporal moments in their history. In other words, you just take this particular moment in their history and he would do a cross-sectional perspective on the theology found at that particular time. I believe that Selhammer would have really aided his reading audience here immensely had he given more specifics with regard to this approach. However, a diachronic synchronic blend certainly seems to have some strong benefits for the theological process, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later as well. There's also in the diachronic methodology a method that is logical, a logical usage. Selhammer begins this section by noting that though it's not always easy to distinguish between a temporal sequence and a logical one, it is helpful to attempt to note the difference. An Old Testament theology that is structured along strictly logical lines of progression may or may not follow a temporal sequence, that is, a time sequence. Under this approach, Selhammer singles out the work of Cocceius. He notes, though that Cocceius did not use a time sequence in his theological work, he was not so much that though he did not, that though he did use a time sequence, he was not so much interested in the time as he was in just simply looking at the status of man with God in the context of covenant change, moving from works to grace. The movement then centers around the logical sequence of works to grace, but it remains diachronic since it remains that diachronic since it's sequential. Under the approach of thematic, Selhammer uses the example of Hossel. He points out that Hossel sequentially uses the date of origin of the books, groups of writings, or blocks of material within these writings. But he imposes a thematic structure on them using the major themes of the Old Testament. Now, this approach was somewhat ambiguous to me. Again, a specific example would certainly have aided in understanding that. Under diachronic, he also speaks of accumulative. Now, this approach recognizes a sequential promise theme across the pages of the Old Testament, but it also notes that many of the themes of the Old Testament are not based on antecedent themes. That should be not there. Not everything in the Old Testament is a natural outgrowth of the earliest, most basic ideas. Kaiser sees the coming of Christ as the central theme throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. In other words, he takes this one central theme. He says the whole of the Old Testament is about that. But he says other themes branch out from that central theme at various sequential times. But the Christ theme remains central across the entirety of the Old Testament writings. In summary, with regard to the diachronic method, it's possible to organize an Old Testament theology on a diachronic basis. Now, that may mean the themes and ideas of the Old Testament are studied within the context of their progressive development and are explained as part of that development. Sometimes the development is explained purely in terms of historical processes, that is, ideas or themes change or evolve in the course of changing times and contexts. Others explain the development of Old Testament ideas as a natural, logical consequence of earlier ideas, unquote. This approach is certainly worthy of our consideration as long as the themes developed are truly sequential in nature and not simply a proposed sequence of the theologian. Did Israel's God change from a polytheistic God to a monotheistic God? Would I make that decision looking at something that's we would say event oriented rather than textual orientation? Would I look outside of the scriptures to propose that what I see in the scriptures is a logical flow from them, such as a polytheistic group of worshipers later on reduce their God to a monotheistic God? So did Israel's God change in that way? Can one actually use the names of God as a means of determining the times of the writing of the text, and thereby posit a theological development based on such usages? A covenantal approach in time and logical sequence would certainly give the reader a better understanding of the movement of the text, but caution would need to be used if the covenant concepts are used to contradict the person and character of God. In other words, shall I say it one early time, he demanded this particular type of concept, but that, since it's not used in the New Testament, would say that what was done in the Old Testament was wrong. It's not wrong, but there is a development that you could certainly see there. Also, an accumulative approach in this matter might be better used with a central unchanging concept at the core of all sequential development, like Kaiser did. We move now to what are called synchronic approaches. As an overview of this, in a synchronic approach, a number of central themes become the basis for searching the text to fill in data about those themes. The great difficulty is seen in which themes are to populate the theologian's central themes. Which ones are truly central? Is it God, humanity, and salvation? That is, looking back to church dogmatics. Shall the theologian look to church dogmatics for that? Should one simply look to the text itself and discover the central themes as revealed in the text? Now, this last approach, this approach that we refer to here, seems to have been a guiding principle for Coxages. Regardless of the decision about topics, the idea of a synchronic approach is to list the topics, whatever they may be, and then relate all portions of the text to those topics. Not necessarily in any kind of sequential order, but not necessarily always ignoring their sequential order either. Selhammer divides his review of this synchronic approach between three predominant ideas. First of all, he looks at a synchronic systematic presentation, a synchronic synthetic presentation, and a synchronic textual presentation. We'll look first at the synchronic systematic presentation. The emphasis in this approach is on looking at the theological topics arranged around a single idea, or maybe just a very limited number of ideas. These ideas, however, must be interrelated to one another. In other words, they're not just having no connection between them whatsoever. And so he notices the four ideas about what really constitutes any system, and he draws this from Brett Schneider. Number one, all the separate ideas in the system must support the whole system. So if I'm talking about in theology, all of the various elements that I'm going to talk about within that theology need to support the system as a whole. It needs to go to create a composite picture of a whole. Number two, there must be a logical interaction between the parts in the system, such that one is a consequence of or consequential to the others. In other words, this system must relate, if you will, and it must do so logically. It is essential in a system like this to show how that one element may have an action on another element, or be acted upon by another element. Number three, the finished product must contain all the parts necessary to the system's successful operation. It has to be an operational portion within it. In other words, can't have this system without this part actually operating within it. The system must show how it works together within it. And then number four, there has to be sufficient reason seen for each part in the system. You have to say why that particular part does what it does within the system. Under the idea of the systematic, if we look at it from a Christological perspective, Selhammer notes Origen's development of Christian theology around Christ as the center idea of everything in the Bible. And then it further is developed under the concept of the Logos, and so from that you can see the reason of man flowing from it. In other words, man's rationality and his reason would be a constituent part of the reason for the Logos coming into the world, and the Logos as being a reasoned communication. All the constituent forms of the Old Testament. And if I go through the entire Old Testament, all of its worship systems, how God acts, etc., the sacrificial system that it has, even the setting up of kingships, and noting various things about those kingships. See, all of those parts of the Old Testament are made to interact, to support the Christian theological system. Yes, there was a kingship in the Old Testament, but that kingship was looking forward to the great Messianic King, Jesus Christ. There's a kingdom concept, but it's all looking forward to the kingdom concept of the New Testament. Both Old Testament then and New Testament elements are grounded in and related in Christ. He then notes that there are, of course, two other systems that are used for Christian theology, ontological and anthropological. We'll look at those next. Under the ontological system, this system seeks to use a philosophical approach based on a single idea of a relationship between God and man. Thomas Aquinas, using Aristotelian concepts, started with the idea of God as prime mover. Now, that's a philosophical concept, and from that he develops the entire system, you might say, of what happens next, the reason for the bringing in of man, this idea God prime mover throughout all of time and history. And that, of course, is a philosophical concept and an idea. All things find their beginning, they find their purpose, and they find their end in God. This ontological approach is not used much today after the time of Kant. It's rather found in the earlier theologies of classical orthodoxy. Now, there are some other ontological systems mentioned by Selhammer. He writes modern metaphysical systems such as idealism, phenomenology, materialism, and process. Looking over those terms, Selhammer really doesn't develop these concepts at all. I personally would have really enjoyed seeing each of these, at least in some small way, developed. I believe the reader would have been given a firmer grasp of the entirety of the ontological approach if other areas of usage were, analyzed in at least a minor way. And then there's also a systematic anthropological approach under the Synchronic. Beginning with Kant, the focus was taken off of God as prime mover, and then we began looking during this age of reason, if you will. Let's look at man, and it's going to be placed on man, examination of man and the elements seen in the text with regard to man. Let's move it off God and let's bring it to man. Now, one such first principle for Schleiermacher's theological system was the element of faith. So we're just going to look at man, if you will, and how he reasons and how he thinks, and we'll take that anthropological approach to creating an entire theology. It'll be man with regard to God, man with regard to kingdom, etc. This section is woefully lacking, I must say, in examples. Even a scant mention of other anthropological considerations other than faith, that would have been greatly appreciated. Then there's also something called the synthetic theological presentation. The most common method, Selhammer says, of synchronic usage is one in which a framework is sought to present all the parts under consideration. Now, you're going to just have to create a framework there. The text itself is not necessarily used to find that framework. In other words, this approach may not necessarily have a common guiding principle behind it. The parts are not necessarily seen as having any discernible interrelationship at all. While Christianity may be the framework upon which parts of the Old Testament are presented, the framework is not necessarily even biblical in origin. Its major consideration is merely whether it's understandable. In other words, I'm going to set before you a framework of thought, and I'm going to put into it the ideas that I wish, the central ideas that I wish to, and then go back to the Bible to try to show how those various elements fill in the framework that I chose. The major theologians that have used this approach generally divide the theological elements of the Bible in a construct of classical derivation. We look at God, humanity, and salvation. Now, why choose those three? Well, someone could say it's obvious that the Bible does talk about God, humanity, and salvation, and look at those across there, and then make all the parts fit within that. But that, again, if you'll notice, is simply something where someone themselves chose the framework, and then just plug things into it. While these elements are certainly seen in the text, the theologian simply chooses the major elements and gives them an overriding structure that are not necessarily developed by the Bible writers themselves. They are a construct of his or her own choosing. Then an attempt at understanding them is made. One of the central concepts behind it is that an understanding must be made. Then you have what's called synchronic scriptural. Synchronic scriptural presentation. Some theologians argue that the scriptures themselves have an inherent synchronic structure. Now, while this idea has some merit, finding this inherent structure has proven elusive. Now, some find the structure in covenant. Others find the structure in concepts of kingdom. Others find the structure in the canonical shape of the Old Testament: law, prophets, and writing. Now, you'll notice that there's a difference here, because at least these theologians, though they can't agree on what the scriptures themselves have as in quote unquote inherent synchronic structure, still they're trying to find that structure within the text itself, even if it's in a canonical overview, just simply saying, look, we have these three sections of the Bible, therefore let's find our theology by looking in each one of these sections and then develop it, especially with regard to the Old Testament. The problem with the synchronic approach is that it seems to so narrow the basic ideas that the constituent elements can be distorted. But by narrowing the prime elements to just a handful of lists, does one do adequate justice to the fullness of those theological elements and the totality of the presentation in Scripture? No, do I get it all in there, or have I already, in this synchronic approach that I've decided, have I said, okay, here's my structure, and then how can I make the elements in the biblical account? How can I make these elements fit that structure? Is there not the tendency then to take those elements and leave out whatever I might not really see as functional in the theological structure that I've made? Then you're going to ask, do they function totally under just one overriding central element? Can I get the totality under just one overriding element or central idea? Selhammer notes the purpose of structure is really to enhance our understanding of material, not to distort that material. And a heavy dependence on structure often leads to what might be termed a reductionist misreading of the Old Testament. And in other words, we don't get it all. We just simply get what fits the synchronic elements that we have proposed. In determining which method of theological presentation is best, diachronic or synchronic, Selhammer concludes that the purpose to be made of the end product may best decide the choice. A guide to reading the Bible might be better served by a diachronic approach. A theology seeking to compare one religion against another might be better served by a synchronic approach. In other words, it's going to take the elements of each religion, not necessarily trying to put them together across time, but just, what does it say about love in this, we might say in this particular religion outside of the Bible, and then say, well, is there anything about love in that? how does that compare with what the Bible gives as an overview, if you will, of love? So that a synchronic approach might be better if you're going to try to compare one religion against another. And this, of course, begs the question of whether there's an actual inherent structure meant to be imposed by the original author of the entirety of the canon. And this is a way of saying what that if there is one mind, the mind of the Holy Spirit behind the entirety of the Scriptures, has He imposed upon the structure of the text, and is there an actual inherent structure imposed by Him? And that can be seen across the entirety of the canon. And as stated before, such a structure is certainly advanced by many, but finding the one central structure, as again as stated before, it's been that's been found to be rather elusive. There is a definite unfolding of acts of God, which brings greater knowledge of the activities of God across the years in His relationship to man. However, the basic person and character of God remains a constant principle throughout the text. It's the same God, though His revelation to man may develop across time. Now, there may be God, you see in the New Testament the idea of the elemental things of the world in reference back to the Old Testament law. In other words, this is kind of like the earliest concepts and thoughts that God would have you learn in order to appreciate the later concepts. And of course, if you looked at the book of Hebrews, you would certainly see this idea of Yom Kippur, which is a very basic concept explaining certain perspectives about sacrifice and their purposes, but not at all the totality of what you see in Christ, who is a fulfillment of those. So you basically see a movement, if you will, a sequential movement, if you would, and a reasoned movement between an Old Testament event and a New Testament fulfilling act. So there are these definite unfolding acts of God. But God remains the same. He's a constant principle throughout the text. Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. God does not Himself change, but how He deals with man changes. Now, the theology of God might be better served not by taking snapshots across history to see how He Himself changed or developed, but by simply compiling these elements to form one consistent picture of God. Now, while Selhammer does give a skeletal picture of the diachronic versus synchronic perspectives, he leaves a lot to be desired in his examples of these systems. The contrast and subsequent understanding of these systems, I think, would be much better served if he gave an example of one or two elements of theological consideration as they have been treated by advocates in each position that he has exposed to his readers' minds. In other words, just take one or two elements and place those into the diachronic and synchronic presentation systems, and notice how they are variously looked at within those systems. That would have been immeasurable help to me. Some additional thoughts here. In consideration of both a synchronic and a diachronic blend, one might consider the elements with regard to man, all found in the Old Testament, and yet they're in the New as well. The real question would be, is there a sequential change in the nature of man across the Bible? We talked about, hey, is there a change in the nature of God? And, of course, we came to the conclusion, no, there's really no change in the nature of God, but is there a change in the nature of man? Is there a sequential change, if you will, in the nature of man across the Bible? Now, we would of necessity need to consider that there is indeed a pre-fall state of man, and then afterwards subsequent change in man's nature after the fall. But carrying this even further, does man's nature progressively change after the fall? We're going to consider some of the elements with regard to man. First of all, pre-fall, and then we shall note that they either are the same or different. We'll note that they do not develop pre-fall, but are static. But after the fall, there is a post-fall nature of man, which seems to change, but I guess only in a physical sense, and yet there is a mental component to it as well, as we shall see in the idea of nakedness. Pre-fall man compared to post-fall man. With regard to man, we note his person before the fall as recorded in Genesis 1 through 6, and then we compare it with post-fall man, a created being within a larger earthly created order. It's described by God as very good. And there doesn't seem to be a difference post-fall, although some say, well, after the fall, man himself is not very good. But that seems to be more theologically oriented. Anyway, he was a created being within a larger earthly created order that was described by God as very good. So we can at least say that man, his creation and the creation itself at creation time was certainly very, very good. Number 2, he alone within the text is presented as being created in the image of God and as a gendered kind. And there's no change post-fall. We don't see any change across the text after the fall. He's given dominion over fish, fowl, and every living thing that moves on the earth. Later, we're told in Psalm 8:5 that he's lower than the angels, but not in regard to the estate given to him, according to Jude 1 and verse 6. So technically, in that area, there's no change post-fall. Now, let me say something that I'm not talking about post-fall. I'm not referring to man after the end of time. I'm not talking about man in an eschatological sense, from a New Testament eschatological sense of man after time, because in those areas there are things stated about man that are different. In other words, he will change. He will move from a spiritual body from a physical body to a spiritual body, according to 1 Corinthians 15. But right now I'm just talking about in the temporal sense. In other words, in time. Are there changes that you see here? Number 4, he's given the ability to procreate other men, other human beings. And there's 2 theories as to what's procreated, but the theories don't really make man different post-fall. There's the creation the theory, man produces the body, God gives the spirit at inception or sometime thereafter. Then there's the that's the creation theory. Then there's the traducian theory, and that's where man produces both body and spirit. And this is the view held by most Calvinists, since it's what makes man, it makes what man produces after the fall all evil. In other words, if God is giving the spirit at inception, then they cannot make man a sinful being from birth. But if they take the traducian theory, which is held by most Calvinists, then that's what would make man, he actually is producing something evil, but that would be after the fall. But as far as we know, there was no production of humankind before the fall against which to compare that. So this really that does not make we don't see a difference post-fall. Man is first made from dust in a lifeless form, into which life is breathed by God so that man can live. Later, from James 2:26, we infer that a spirit was placed in man. It was placed in man, but this life-giving breath of God. So that's really the same with regard to the makeup, if you will, of man. Man is first introduced as a dichotomous being, having both a fleshly body and an ethereal spirit. Trichotomy is later adduced from such passages as 1 Thessalonians 5:23, body, soul, and spirit. Well, the question is then asked, has man developed from a dichotomous to a trichotomous being from the Old Testament to the New Testament, or shall we simply understand that a further expression of his nature is given in a progressed revelation, or that soul and spirit are both under consideration as one part, and thus he is still a dichotomous being? Well, technically we would say that whatever he was at the beginning, he continued to be, and so there's no real change there. And number 6, he was capable of interaction with the natural creation of God, and that's still the same today. He's created to be active both mentally and physically, applying his mental efforts to effective physical labor in the garden. He can still do that in this day and time. So that's the same, pre and post. He's capable of receiving communication from God. That's the same, pre and post. Capable of understanding commands from God with their attendant penalties, inclusive of death. That's the same, pre and post. He's capable of consuming the produce of the ground. That's the same, pre and post. He's capable of living forever in his present form. Now that's different. We'll talk more about that, the capability of his living together, or living forever in his present form, because it may be that it is merely the difference between something he eats or continues to eat while in the garden that keeps that life going. But we'll talk about that in a moment. He's self-cognizant as a different entity, distinct from other entities and life forms. He saw the animals and knew he was different with no female counterpart like himself. Well, that's the same today. People are still capable of that cognizance of themselves, so no real difference there. He's created with a communicative ability. He named the animals. He still has that communicative ability, both then pre and post. Number 14, he's created with physical passions, no gendered counterpart like himself. So he had physical passions, and he desired that gendered counterpart, and he got that gendered counterpart. That's the same pre and post. He's created with a need for social interrelationships. It wasn't good for him to be alone. That's the same for us as it was for him. That is pre and post. Capable of sleep. That's the same pre and post. He was capable of entering a marriage relationship with its attendant intimacy. That's the same pre and post. He was made without shame of nakedness. That's different. At this adult period of his life, he still had no shame of nakedness pre, but post he did, after the fall. He's capable of memory. The woman rehearsed the command to the serpent so she could remember what it was. So that's the same in memory capability. Capable of deceit. She deceived her husband, she was deceived. She's capable of being deceived. That's the same today as it was before the fall. He's capable of desire, to be like God who created them. So that's the same. People can still have that kind of desire within them. Capable of taste, sight, and desire to aspire to higher things, and able to pursue a desire to its fulfillment. That's the same, both pre and post. The capacity of choice to follow one's will. I would say it remains the same, but the theologies of Augustine, Calvin, and Luther say differently. But it does not develop, we would say, over time in either case. It's just kind of like a momentary concept, no further development in either case. Created sinless, but with a capacity to choose either good or evil. Now, that's a little different. He's now sinned, but now having sinned. But it's not an inherent sinfulness from birth, and yet that too is challenged by the theologies of Augustine, Calvin, and Luther. Which methodological method is best in this case in looking at man? Diachronic or synchronic? Well, I think a blend of the two would actually be essential here. Man is essentially the same post-fall as he is pre-fall, which would lend itself easily to a synchronic approach to man. However, there are some differences post-fall. He's now subject to death after sinning. However, one might ask whether this is something to which he was already subject, but could stay alive by eating of the tree of life, Genesis 3:22. In either case, the tree's removal changes his ability to live forever. So the ability to live forever changes for him, but I'm not sure it's because of the body that he had, though many say that it is for that reason, so I've placed it under some differences. Number 2, man now has a self-awareness with regard to nakedness. That is something he absolutely did not have before, and that he does have afterward. Number 3, the capacity for choice was definitely present pre-fall, else they could not have been persuaded to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. As noted earlier, Augustine, Calvin, and Luther all stated this ability was taken from man to one degree or another. However, this is a theological belief based on later considerations, which is not borne out in the Bible as far as I'm able to ascertain, but I set it in because some, in looking across that, use certain New Testament scriptures to say that there is a change in that. Number 4, another consideration pertaining to this concept is the diminishing age of man. In other words, he starts out with these long ages, and then you come across the the Old Testament after the flood, and you see these ages slowly begin to go down till you have an approximate age, sometimes listed as 70 years old, as being a good ripe old age for man. Conclusion then, the nature of man remains fairly constant across the Bible, which would lend itself easily to a synchronic approach, but the few differences subsequent to the fall of man would allow for a minor role for a diachronic theological approach. Thus, while in the case of God, a synchronic approach alone would suffice to speak of God, the same yesterday, today, and forever, a blend of synchronic and diachronic might better suit a theology about the person and nature of man. And I found the study interesting. As I stated before, would really have loved to have seen some good examples. Just take two, maybe perhaps elements, one or two elements, and the same one or two elements be placed into each of the systems by Selhammer to see how they would be advanced in each of the systems. I'm finished.